can join while we start this
Sure.
talk. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Dr. Shaun McFadden from Ulster University. He is one of the recipient of the LiME Hub Feasibility Study Awards, and today he's going to talk about basically the work funded by this feasibility studies. So, Shaun, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chang. And just to, I called this project the NUPRO Project. And to give a bit of a presentation outline, there's 5 topics I want to cover. And first of all, I'd just like to introduce the personnel who supported me with this, who helped and supported. So I'm the principal investigator of this. I was able to hire a research associate with the funds, and that was Dr. Sahar Sana, who joined from the University of Newcastle, a chemical engineer, but has adapted very well to solidification science, I must add. And other supporters on this were Professor David Brown from University College Dublin and Professor Rangwald Mathieson, who's with us today. Now, Sahar and David send their apologies. They wish they could be here, but they just can't. They have schedule conflicts. Many of you will know me, but some of you may not. And I just wanted to give you an overview of my research activity and hopefully show you where this project in particular fits into the landscape of my research interests. So I have an interest in directional solidification and both modeling work and experimental work. So the modeling work, I had two PhD students work in this area, Dr. Robin Mooney and Dr. Sarah Battiglioli, so using front tracking methods to model directional solidification, in particular modeling Bridgman furnace and transient Bridgman furnace solidification. I have an interest in Equiaxed solidification, then grain refinement and so forth, and I'll talk about that in much more detail today. And then leading into the columnar to Equiaxed transition, which is maybe a very natural, but I would say non-trivial extension of the previous 2 domains. Recently, then, we have interests in additive manufacturing, so modeling moving point heat source. So I have a research associate, Dr. Sagar Nikam, working on this, and PhD candidate, Miss Anna Harley. And also recently just interested in liquid phase separation that happens during the separation phase or the monotectic alloys, so looking at what happens in the liquid as it separates out. So I have Dr. Emma Kerr and Miss Courtney Gallagher, who is a PhD candidate working in this area. Working with in collaboration with Access EV in Germany. But just going into directional solidification, just quickly going through some of this. This is work that I do in collaboration with Professor Anthony Robinson, who's a heat transfer specialist at Trinity College Dublin, and Mr. Turlock Hughes, who is a PhD candidate that we co-supervise. And this is an alloy, an neopentyl glycol alloy, alloyed with camphor, so 35% weight camphor. The interesting thing about this alloy is, well, it's transparent first of all, but it also undergoes dendrite orientation transitions. So it's a face-centered cubic crystallography, but it changes morphology based on composition. So at low compositions, it's a classic 100, and then at 30% or above 30%, it starts to exhibit 111 growth behavior. And Turlock is who's on the line today. I'm just going to show you some of his work. So you should see the apparatus here. We do solidification from the bottom up, and behind the dendrite tips, it's quite difficult. It's quite translucent and very difficult to pick up some detail. But at the dendrite tip itself, you can see some detail there. And with a very robust and very novel algorithm, you're able to determine both the velocity growth rate and the orientation of the dendrite tips. And there you see a thermocouple within the sample, and eventually it's going to come up and you will see that it is going to give you a reasonable estimate of the temperature at the tips. as you go through as it reaches. And so the best analogy I can give for this work is that we're no longer just identifying select dendrites as being representative of the growth, but we're trying to analyze the entire forest of dendrites. What did we do with this? Well, here's some work. Obviously, tip velocity versus undercooling is an interest. Just to give you some of the background on this, you see some data points here that were available through microgravity experimentation. This was done through the traced experiment and all done at reasonably high undercooling, 7 degrees or 7 Kelvin and above, both columnar and equiaxed. The reason it's at such a high undercooling is because it's microgravity sounding rockets and it's time limited, so they had to grow fairly quickly to get something reasonable within the time frame. So that left a gap in the knowledge here below 7 Kelvin. So we looked at trying to fill this gap, and you see the data points that we've generated here. They don't really fit this LGK curve. This is a modified LGK where they modified the stability parameter. But looking here and going back into the older work, the Cantor-Vogel is an adaptation to the Avantsov theory where delta is a boundary layer. And by applying boundary layers, which are very reasonable, we're able to get agreement with the results in our case, which are performed on terrestrial results. So that's what we're looking at in that case. And also looking at another automatic system that tracks the front, but then it crops a window around the front position, and then it concatenates the figures and builds up this true representation of the growth. And what you can see is a lot more detail. So you can see the orientation, the colonies of the grains, the grain boundaries, and you can see primary and secondary dendrite arms. So we did quite a few of these experiments, and we looked at the orientations, and you'll recall that there's the Walton-Chalmers orientation mechanism that says that there's a preferred orientation for crystal growth, directional crystal growth, if it's columnar. And you see here the example at the bottom middle is classic Walton-Chalmers. So you see the orientation initially can be quite, on average, is quite large, but then it converges down to a preferred orientation of 0, in other words, growing in the vertical direction. And you also see the error bars are the spread of the orientation measurements, and they're also reducing. So in that case, you do see classic Walton-Chalmers behavior. But in other cases, you will see that it deviates from Walton-Chalmers. In fact, it doesn't find converge down to a preferred orientation. And in some cases, it grows. It goes a bit more chaotic. And then in some cases, it diverges and then it converges. And in particular, we have examples of the exact same scenario under the same process conditions with the same material, remelted back and regrown, and sometimes obeying Walton-Chalmers and sometimes disobeying it completely. So we used the tracking, and we could also track the secondary arms as well. And we've looked here, and it's really because we think there are some particular orientations in 111 growth where the secondary and tertiary arms are just as competitive as the primary arms. So that's, I think, something that's interesting that hasn't really been looked at previously. So the 100 growth will obey the Walton-Chalmers. The 111 growth is selectively disobeying the Walton-Chalmers based on orientation. Moving on then to Equiaxed Solidification. We've developed this method called the Nucleation Progenitor Function approach. And I just say that this was published in 2018. And we based this on the MEDI experiment. And I'm going to go into much more detail in this, so I'm just going to move quickly on from this one. Moving on to columnar to equiaxed transitions. So there's a series of experiments done throughout the CETSOL project. Experimental data was gathered from the International Space Station, where they did Bridgman type solidification. And under different kind of transient conditions, they were able to get different types of CET. And with a velocity jump, you get a very sharp CET. So you see this columnar solidification and then transitioning very abruptly into equiaxed. And then when you do gradient decrease, you see that it is best described as being majority columnar to begin with, and then majority equiaxed at the end. And even at the end, you'll see very clear evidence of elongated columnar grains within the structure. They become less prominent at the end, but this is what we call a progressive CET. So it's not a sharp CET. So how to capture this? Well, we used the Nucleation Progenitor Function approach for equiaxed, and we used front tracking for the columnar. And we did a fairly fundamental thing. We said, well, why don't we just completely disband with any mechanical blocking criterion? There's a very famous mechanical blocking criterion by Professor Hunt, and we said we would just try and model this using Kolmogorov principles, which were the principles of the Rami equation. And so you see here the navy blue that is coming up, or the darker blue, is the equiaxed fraction. So in the case of velocity jump, you see a very sharp transition from columnar to equiaxed. And you see the solid fraction in the black line. But then in the case beneath, you see a very progressive transition from the equiaxed as it overtakes the columnar solidification. So this is kind of the behavior qualitatively that we were looking for in the modeling. And then when we compared that, and if you look at the extents and try to map against the different positions, I think the agreement is reasonably good. There were 4 experiments done in total, and we were able to then take the information from the simulation. So this is the information, the tip rate and the tip growth rate and the temperature gradient at the solidification front, and able to map this onto a Hunt diagram. And what we found was that it was very hard to get a single set of nucleation parameters that would, for the Hunt diagram, that would satisfy all 4 cases. It was practically very difficult, I would say impossible to do. What we were able to do, though, with the simulations, all 4 cases, we were all able to simulate faithfully the CET transitions in all 4 using a consistent set of parameters, using the combined concurrent columnar to equiaxed transition model. Very briefly then, moving point heat sources. So modeling in ANSYS and Fluent, we are looking at what's the effect of Marangoni convection on the moving point heat source. So there's a temperature gradient across the top of the surface of the melt pool in additive manufacturing, and then this causes a surface tension gradient, and that sets up a Marangoni convection. The effect of that Marangoni convection is to reduce the overall peak temperature. It sort of broadens out the melt pool and it makes it less deep. It's shallow. It makes it more shallow. So other ways of doing that, a kind of a simplified way of doing that, is to artificially increase the thermal conductivity in the liquid if you're modeling with conduction only. That will have the same effects. And so that's done quite a lot in literature, but there's not really much agreement as to what correction factor you should use. So what we did here was we modeled in Fluent with Marangoni convection, and then we modeled in ANSYS using APDL with the conduction code. And we did the modification of each, and we modified surface tension gradient in this Fluent model, and we modified the correction factor for thermal conductivity in liquid in the APDL conductivity model. And we got this relationship, so that's out there now for people to use if they find it useful. Okay, so back to our outline. So a very important point to move on here is to express this nucleation progenitor function approach. So the MEDI experiment was flown on the Maser 13 sounding rockets, and it achieved around 6 minutes of microgravity. So within this assembly, you have a little pocket here of the sample, and it's heated top and bottom. It has 3 thermocouples inside, and you were able to observe this window, and it's backlit, so you can see through all of the Equiaxed crystals. One of the nice things about neopentyl glycol decamphor alloy is that it's quite a good Equiaxed former. And so this, at low temperature gradients, it was able to perform Equiaxed. And just to, hopefully you can see a video of the microgravity video data that was obtained. And you see there's a slight temperature gradient, so it's slightly cooler at the bottom and slightly hotter at the top. And then you see the solidification coming up. And that was as much as they were able to do in microgravity. But it's a lot, and there's some good information there. They were able to get the frequency of the nucleation events. They were also able to do some thresholding here of the images to get the area fraction. And so all of this data was out there. They also had a nice optics system where they were able to zoom in and magnify individual crystals, and they were able to get some average tip velocity versus undercooling. So again, growing at around 6 to 8 Kelvin of undercooling. And because the thermocouples were inserted within the sample, they also have pretty good temperature data inside as well. So one of the issues that we came across with this experiment, the sample itself is around 3 millimeters thick in depth. So the crystals are much smaller than 3 millimeters. So that causes what we call a stereology problem. So it was backlit, and it's observed from the front. And this is a solid model that I developed here, and you can see that individually, none of these particles are impinging with each other. They're all isolated, separate, individual particles. But when you project them onto the front, you get this problem of overprojection. So some of them seem to be overlapping, but they're not. And some of them will be unobservable because they're either obstructed from view or in the shadow of a bigger crystal. So you don't really get a true representation on the plane. You get an aerial representation of what happens in 3D. So trying to get to the bottom of this and trying to tackle this problem, we returned back to the Kolmogorov definitions of the Avrami equation. So one of the most famous equations in transformation kinetics. If you go back to Kolmogorov, he was a statistician, and he did a lot of statistical analysis and introduced this concept of real and phantom nucleation. And so we revisited, and what we looked at is you have this nuclear activation rate, first of all. So all of your seed particles are passive, and then they become active. So this would be like initiation, let's say. But how many of these are actually real, and how many are, to quote a phrase, phantom? So what does phantom mean? Phantom means how many of these were actually if they had nucleated, they would have nucleated in a previously transformed region. So they never nucleated. But from a mathematical perspective, Kolmogorov insisted that you should really model the phantom nucleation as well, and then you can develop a much more consistent mathematical model. So you have real nucleation. These are the ones that we're trying to capture that really nucleate in 3D. But extending that principle again to 2D, so we can look at Kolmogorov principles here. So we can get, the real nucleation events, we can calculate how many of those are observable based on area fraction and volume fraction and the depth of the sample. Or we could just go directly here from the activation rate and calculate the number of observation based on this. So it gives you the same results, whichever way you do it.
That's the one feature, yeah. And this, to me, is
okay. Is there somebody maybe is their microphone switched on? Okay, so let's go. And so the idea here is that there is a way here of calculating the number of observed in the 2D plane. And so we get the outputs here are real nucleation in 3D, observed nucleation in 2D. You get volume fraction and area fraction. And with all of this information, you can construct the complete picture. So we compared this then to some of the classical stereology. So Underwood had some correction factors, and if you break it down, you can show that they're equivalent. It is equivalent. So what is nucleation progenitor function approach? It's new terminology that we've introduced, and what we're trying to do is look at it in a different way, and that will be more instructive. And in particular, we're aiming to define progenitor-progeny relationships within the theory of microstructural kinetics. What's a progenitor? A progenitor is a function that describes where all seeds come from, or how all seeds are arranged in the domain. So both they're assumed to be distributed uniformly following a Poisson distribution, and then you can have any distribution, athermal distribution in undercooling. Here we show that one by Oldfield, which was 1966. This is a normal distribution. You can have log normal distribution, and that might be closer to the work of Professor Greer and co-workers. You could have exponential. You could have a Dirac function, and that would be able to model explosive nucleation. But all of these, this is like a plug and play. So you need a description of nucleation, an athermal nucleation, and that we call this the progenitor function. So the progenitor function describes seed activation, but not necessarily seed nucleation, or initiation, as we may call it. So one of the things that we found was one of the benefits of looking at this NPF approach and looking at the Kolmogorov methods, that there's a host of statistical tools available that give really good information if you look at it in this way. So we're using the first thing we do is apply a coordinate transformation. So we can change, if you have the time temperature curves, you can go from undercooling to time-based coordinate transformation. That's very easy to do. So you can do that either through modeling, or you could do it, I suppose you could do it experimentally as well if you had the cooling curves. But then we apply this approach, which is exactly the approach that I've just described to you. And we look at this here as the progenitor. And then down below, these sort of children, these are the progeny of the progenitor. So here's the progenitor that applies across all. It's a full description of the nucleation characteristic, and the progeny functions that come out of this then are shown here, and they're all derived off the progenitor. So here you have a real progeny. The real progeny is what really nucleates, and the difference between the progeny and the progenitor is phantom nucleation. You also have a progeny for the 2D observation on the 2D plane, and because it's separate units, we have it here on the right hand side here with so it looks slightly different, but this is also derived from the progenitor. There's one progenitor that applies across the entire domain as a description of the grain refiner. But every single nodal point in this simulation and in the domain will have its own progeny that develops over time. So there's a lot of information available from all of these progeny that all come from one progenitor. And what you're able to do then is obviously you can integrate to get nucleation density, nucleation counts. And you can also then compare the activation rate to the real rate, and you can get the nucleation efficiency. Continuing on with these statistical tools, you can reverse the coordinate transformation at any point. So you can go back into the undercooling domain, and you can normalize, which is another statistical process, and you can apply the expected value theorem. And through the application of this, you are able to determine mean undercooling, the standard deviation of the undercooling, the real undercooling. And indeed, if you wanted to, you could go higher order statistics. You could also calculate skewness, kurtosis, up to that level. So what are the advantages of NPF? So if we're doing anything, we want to add value to it. So why are we doing it this way? We're doing it this way because of these particular advantages. We can easily include the stereology correction. That was the initial motivation for doing it. But what we found was through this normalization process and using application of expected value theorems, at any point you're able to develop formative outputs or running statistics or summative outputs at the end of the simulation. As I explained, there are progeny functions at every nodal point. So how do you summate all of these? Well, if you use the principle of convolution, you can add all of these progeny together in any, and then you get an entire global representation of the nucleation across the entire domain, or any domain of interest, really. So we did here the entire domain, and we're able to get a global output for nucleation across the entire undercooling domain. So to show you some of the results, the microstructure kinetics drives the latent heat evolution in the sample. So you see here the thermal agreement. So we're able to get quite good agreement here with the measured cooling curves. Looking on the right, some of the running statistics that we were able to develop and observe from the experiment itself and what we were able to model. So looking here at the black, you have the number of nuclei here is observed in 2D, and the number predicted by the model. Well, observed in 2D is these dots, these circles, and then the black line is what was actually simulated. So reasonable agreement, and then you see what couldn't be measured. Here the model is able to predict what the number of real nucleation events were in 3 dimensions. So that includes the ones that were unobservable. Looking then at area fraction in the blue curve. So the simulated area fraction here is the solid blue line, and then the white circles are the area fraction that were measured, and reasonable agreement, I would think, to quite good agreement. And in particular here, then you see the volume fraction. Now, volume fraction is always an underestimate of area fraction, and the number of real nucleations in 3D is always greater than the number of observed. So we're able to gather this information from the model, and in particular, the latent heat is driven by the volume fraction. So you may say we couldn't observe directly or compare, confirm or validate directly the volume fraction, but the volume fraction informs the thermal model and drives the latent heat. So since we have thermal agreement, we should be quite close on the volume fraction as well. Some more statistics here. We have average undercooling that was observed and modeled. And you see that the average undercooling was around 7, and it increased up to around 8. And so you see the simulated in the solid line, and also the standard deviation. The standard deviation tended to reduce. And there was a slight increase here measured, but generally the trend was a decreasing trend, and that was captured in the model as well. Finally, through the principle of convolution, by taking all of these progeny functions as they complete their course, as they go through the entire range of solidification times, you're able to then combine them all and pool them to give you one curve here for the distribution of real nucleation events. And we compared that then to what was measured, and we had quite good agreement on that. So moving forward then with this project, the NUPRO project. So the argument you could have at this nucleation progenitor function approach is that it's only applied to the transparent systems, and you were dealing with stereology and other things. But a very natural progression of this model was to bring it then to aluminium or to metal alloy systems, and so that had to be done. And so that was really the basis of this NUPRO project, this feasibility study, to see was this method feasible for 2D X-ray radiography as shown here. So on board the Major 13 rocket, so the same experiment rocket as the MEDI, it carried the MEDI. There was also a module here called X-Harmon Sol. And here's the furnace makeup. And there is an X-ray source on board, and you were able to control the temperature. So there was a heating phase and then a 3-phase cooling stage. And I'm going to show you here, there was some solidification, Equiaxed solidification observed. So hopefully you can see this. This is the left-hand side is the microgravity. The right-hand side is a repeat experiment on ground. And you can see the Equiaxed solidification. And finally, if you look closely, you can see the eutectic transformation occurring as well at the very final stage. So you see that it's quite slow, and then it goes through a rapid cooling phase, and then it goes eutectic like that. Okay. So the model details, then we had to replicate this furnace, and so you have your sample pocket, you have glassy carbon, you have your sample, you have a cover, and then you have this X-ray aperture in the middle, which is conical to account for the diverging X-ray beam that's going through. We applied the temperature at the boundaries, but we also have more heat input from the outside. So this is from the furnace. This is really a tuning parameter, this heat transfer coefficient for the furnace. So this is an important tuning parameter. You have heat loss from the top. So we estimated what the heat transfer loss would be from the top. And then in the center, you have what I would say it's like a cold finger, where you have both convective and radiative heat losses through the sample, through the X-ray aperture. So this does cause a cold finger effect. Just some of the model details. So it's a continuum model. The biggest difference here is that we had to move away from spherical growth, so spherical representative element volumes, to disc-like geometry to account for the thin samples. Now, there's no stereology issue with this because it's a thin sample. So the stereology problems and transmission all go away because of the very, very thin sample. So that was one aspect that was simpler for us in this case. And some other details here. We use a Rapathivo model. It's essentially Child Gulliver, to be honest, with an isothermal eutectic transformation. We're using LGK growth law, and a new addition to the model here is we're trying to represent the radius of growth on average, the average growth radius at any particular point. And we do this by a back calculation, and we'll show you some of those results today. A very interesting point that we discovered is the recalescence, and the model wasn't working very well until we actually made a deeper investigation into why it was recalescence. And essentially, the model was originally set up to be fully reversible, following both the nucleation and the Scheil curves faithfully, both on heating and cooling. But what we found worked best was that when you cool down and when you reach a saddle point, it starts to reheat because of the latent heat, and the growth continues. It's still undercooled, so the growth is still continuing, but we had to switch off the nucleation. So the idea is that the nucleation would under reheating, under recalescence, would have to go to 0, and would have to only reinitiate again when it would reach this point here at the end of stage 2, which is at the same point. Also, more importantly, was that we had to maintain the solid fraction during the recalescence phase. So we assumed no remelting or no thinning inside the envelopes. Now, the solidification does proceed. If we look at the breakdown here of the solid fraction, one of these is a thickening term and one is a growth term. The growth term continues regardless of whether there's recalescence or not. It just goes at different rates depending on the undercooling. But the thickening term, we had to prevent it from becoming a thinning term. The upshot of this is that if we didn't do this, then the model would become oscillatory and unstable. And so this was something we pondered and something we looked at, and we think it's quite physical and quite realistic, and it would be worthy of further investigation, especially this point on the thinning of equiaxed within the envelope under recalescence. But we think this worked well. So to show you the field of view, so the X-ray only looks, anything you see here is in this square box. So we had to model the entire domain. The white broken line that you see there is the liquidus isotherm. And so somewhat similar to the botanist that goes out to the field and throws a wooden frame and then counts the fauna within the wooden frame, we're looking at this box in the middle, and we're trying to get statistics in this box for the nucleation. And so that's what we're trying to do here. So the first advantage here is we've modeled the heating phase and the solidification, and the furnace is in red, and the central CV control volume is in black, and you can see the effects here of latent heat. So you see eutectic latent heat recalescence, or not, well, this change here is due to eutectic transformation. There's very little recalescence, but it's very, very sensitive to this issue of recalescence. So that's why we had to pay particular attention to it. It's right on the cusp of recalescence, I would say. Also, one of the advantages here is we're able to determine the difference now between the control volume, or estimate the difference in the temperature of the control volumes to the furnace, which is something that wasn't available in the experimentation. You only have furnace temperature in the experiment. So here we see potential added value. Looking at growth, LGK growth, and looking at the actual growth measured from measuring 4 directions on select dendrites, you can see that it doesn't really live up to the LGK growth, and that's because of impingement. And comparing that then to the model results, our model is driven by LGK growth, but that drives the extended volume. It doesn't drive the real growth. And the back calculation of the radius allowed us then to calculate the real growth rate after impingement. So if you see here, these are the 4 grains. So and these are the back calculated growth rates for all of these grains at different locations, and we're getting between, I'd say, around 13 micrometers per second, and that's not so far off from the average growth rates when you combine each individual crystal. You know, the average growth rate in the 4 directions, it would be quite close, I would imagine. And also then looking at the length of the arms, so this is the in micrometers. So again, looking in 4 directions and looking at the 4 the lengths and getting an average, you would then be able to compare the average to what was predicted by the model. And here's what was predicted by the model. So qualitatively reasonable agreement, and we were getting around 500 microns for the final arm lengths, and that's not so far off from the average if you were to look at the average on these 2 cases as well. They looked at volume fraction. Now, in this case, this is the volume fraction that was measured from the experiment, and from 240 to 360, it was from slowly getting up to about 0.6. So in the model, we're a little bit out, we're a little bit high. We're up at around 0.9, and I think I have some ideas why that is, and I would like to address those going forward. So that's the red curve would compare with these curves. And then you see here the solid fraction. So this uptake here in the solid fraction, that is due to a higher cooling rate. So it's a knee point in the cooling rate curve. And then you see this vertical transition here. This is the eutectic coming in. So we've added eutectic to the model as well, which is something we've done through this feasibility study as well. Experimental versus modeling. You have all of the grains. There were 22 crystals observed in this field of view, and you have the locations, and you have the timestamp, and you have the furnace temperature, not the sample temperature, but the furnace temperature. Just to give you an idea, the liquidus temperature for this alloy is aluminium 28% copper. It's around 603 degrees Celsius. So these aren't representative of the sample, but we were able to look at this on average and get here the white circles are the predictions, of nucleation events within that field of view, and the red here is what was actually measured. So it gets a little bit, the rate's a little bit higher in the real experiment. We're both getting to around 22. We're both getting exactly 22 nucleated crystals within the domain. I do have an idea as to why this is a little bit slower, and I would like to work on this going forward as well. So, in conclusion, the NPF approach has been applied to metal alloy solidification. So that was the initial premise of this application. So the approach is feasible. Why do anything? You have to show advantage. So the advantages of the NPF approach, observing this through the progenitor progeny lens, it's a new way of looking at it that we're proposing. The microstructure kinetics are fully integrated into the thermal model. Indeed, the microstructure nucleation and growth rates drive the latent heat. Athermal nucleation models are plug and play. So we can go back and we can put any athermal description, whether it's a Greer log normal, whether it's a delta Dirac, which would model explosive nucleation. We could use any kind really, and we could just look across and analyze it in different modes. I say here, maybe a little bit glibly, but I think there's a wealth of statistical information available as either running or final statistics. And that's something that we got from this progenitor progeny approach. Stereology effects are easily accounted for when the sample is bulky, so that was a problem with the MEDI experiment, and we were able to overcome that problem. It's not really a problem for the thin film samples, the X-ray samples. But consider this: if you're doing this post-mortem, if you're doing a traditional etching, polishing and etching of a sample, you have a different kind of stereology problem. You have a sectioning stereology problem. So your volume fraction and your area fraction will be kind of similar, but the average grain sizes will be smaller because you've taken a section, you've taken a cut through. That's if assuming it's equiaxed, of course. So what we demonstrate here is that you can get this progeny function at a particular point. You can look at a select area within the field of view, or you could, in theory, model the entire casting using this approach. So this method can be scaled up to any casting to give global information. Temperature gradients. So a nice benefit of looking at the convolution principles and combining or pooling all this information together is that low temperature gradients don't really present a problem. As long as the growth is equiaxed, it's low gradient, then we're able to model that using the approach here and combining all those statistics as that I've just mentioned in the presentation. Grain refiner performance can be estimated, so we can look at grain refiner efficiency. It has already been extended to the CET. So the nucleation progenitor function approach that you see that I've presented today was also the basis of the equiaxed in the CET modeling that I showed you at the very start. And so it does go into the high gradient, high temperature gradient where you would have columnar growth as opposed to equiaxed growth. And more importantly, what we've done is we've been able to model not just different phases, but different morphologies of phases, which I think is a nice addition and a nice additionality to any modeling aspects previously done. Future work. Solute rejection effects can be added, and I have very firm ideas how this can be done, and I think that would form the basis of a very nice piece of work going forward. It would be nice to add in more phases. So in this particular project, we look at the primary alpha phase, and we looked at eutectic. we could do some more work on this, and in particular, if there was some interest around other, say, phases like intermetallic phases, for instance, then perhaps that's something that could also be worked into the model. So looking at more phases and how, and as I said, that we did look at phases, and we also have the CET model, which looks at morphology of phases. So there's a lot there to look at. Final point here, I'm just going to say here is, well, it's not the final point, but can we establish progeny-progenitor relationships? Can we go backwards from progeny to progenitor? Could be quite difficult to do, but if we can do it, and we can do it within a certain, and defend it in some way, I think that would be a very useful thing, because it really will be a way to characterize grain refiners. Final point, remote working arrangements work. So I'm based here in Derry, Londonderry, as you might know it, and I actually work from home in County Donegal. And my co-workers on this, Dr. Sahar Sana, was based in England. I've never met Sahar, but we've had weekly meetings and sometimes bi-weekly meetings, working very productively, getting all of this together. Also, David Brown is in Dublin and Rangwald is in Norway. And I think one thing the pandemic, it's as terrible as it has been, it has taught us that you can work remotely now. The world is a smaller place. So I may be separated by land and sea, but I'm still very much connected in and able to work on this type of work in particular. Just I would invite some questions and answers. Thank you for listening. I hope all of that was clear and no technology issues. So thank you.
Okay, Shaun, thank you for a very interesting and nice piece of work, and definitely, yeah, sharing a lot of interesting results and food for thoughts. So, yeah, so the talk is open for any questions from the audience.
Okay, Shaun, maybe I can kick off then, Animalis. I was interested in what you were saying about recalescence.
Yeah.
So obviously we do lots of rapid solidification experiments. So our undercoolings are much higher than the undercoolings you were talking about. But we definitely observe remelting of dendrites. We definitely observe thinning of dendrites, and even to the point of dendrite fragmentation. And I was interested in the fact that it seemed that you could only get an agreement in your experiments by turning that phenomena off.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, what's the difference? Because you kind of said without explanation you thought there was a physical basis for that.
Well, I think there's a physical basis for switching off the nucleation. Make that maybe just clarify what I said there was on terms of the nucleation. If everything had been nucleated up to that undercooling level, and then it undergoes recalescence, so it reheats, the undercooling will reduce, and there's nothing there that, you know, if there's nothing mobile moving around, there shouldn't really be anything nucleating at that lower undercooling until that undercooling surpasses the previous maximum or the previous, so I think that
that I agree with, but
okay.
I thought you also said that you turn your thickening function off.
Yeah,
so
it turned the thickening function off. So in terms of that one, that is worthy of further investigation. I would agree with you on that. Let me clarify that point. What I would say to you is the thinning mechanics are probably much slower than the or different. Let's say very different from the solidification mechanics. And at those low undercoolings, I decided to turn it off and to assume that it just didn't thin. Okay. So I'm assuming it's negligible, I suppose, but I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. And I think it's a function of undercooling, and it's also a function of time. So how much time do you have for it to thin? I think you would have those effects would become much stronger at rapid solidification, higher undercoolings, and so on.
And of course we have a much bigger recalescence. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, okay.
But look, Brian Kenter here. It's plausible to say that it's negligible, that's a perfectly good reason for then perhaps turning it off. But I think but you said something a bit more. You said if you didn't turn it off, you've got oscillation. That implies that now that shouldn't happen. If you see what I mean. If the issue is that it's a negligible effect, well, it's a negligible effect, and it should just be negligible. And you know, if it's affecting your that implies there's something incorrect in the model because you're having to turn it off. You know, you shouldn't have to turn off a negligible effect, if you see what I mean.
It's not negligible if it's not turned off.
Well, that's the point, if you see what I mean. Yeah. So, you know, it means that you're modeling you're doing something wrong in the modeling because it's giving you, I mean, you're not experimentally observing an oscillatory effect. So
no, we're not, and we're not. Neither are we observing a thinning of the dendrites. The dendrites seem to be quite stable.
Yeah.
In terms of yeah.
So experimentally,
maybe that's just to clarify. This is what I've done is I've held it stable as it recoalesces.
But when you include that in the modeling, why does it? You know,
well, what happens is that the thinning follows the child Gulliver in reverse, and I don't think that's accurate.
Oh, that could be.
And that's the point. That's the point.
That is probably true. That is probably true.
That's the point. That's the point. So thank you for asking the question, but that's the point. If it follows the child of Gulliver in reverse, it just doesn't work.
So that, I think it's a better description. So what you're saying is really that the function which you would have used for, which you're using for the thinning, isn't working, and therefore, but in fact it's a negligible effect, so you can switch it off rather than find a more appropriate function, which would just complicate the model unnecessarily. Yeah, that's it. Okay, I think I can buy that. Yeah, that's good. That was it. I must admit, Andy, I wondered about that point when you were a bit coy about it when you said, "I think I know what's going on, but I'm not going to." You didn't say I'm not going to tell you, but it was sort of implied.
Yeah, no, I pondered whether I should include that slide, but I'm glad I did because it's brought up some good scientific discussion on it, I think.
I'm very pleased. Did I hear you say that you got agreement in the early thing you were talking about by using the work that I did with Fred Vogel?
Yes.
That's fantastic. I'm really pleased about that. Have you published that? Is that paper published?
In preparation.
Good. Okay, because that's a blast from the past. You know, it's another of my bits of work that people have completely ignored. But I'm pleased to hear it's not completely ignored.
No, not at all. Not at all. No.
Shaun, can I ask you another question related to other subjects? CET.
Yes. Yes.
And I missed the point. Did you see you change the growth rate, increase or decrease, and then the front blocking mechanism is not working?
It works for velocity jump. So there's two experiments. One is velocity jump. So imagine like a Bridgman furnace where you're translating the furnace and the sample, and then you suddenly step up the speed of the growth and the pulling rate. You step up the pulling rate, and then the conditions change, and the undercoolings will increase, and then you get equiaxed nucleation occurring. So that gives a very sharp CET. The other one then is where you do gradient decrease. So as you're pulling the sample, you start to cool the heater very slowly, and then so the temperature gradient is lowering. So you still have the same pulling rate, but the temperature gradient is reducing. In that case, the blocking criterion doesn't work as well. And my explanation to that is that if you go back to John Hunt's CET, what he suggests is the blocking fraction should be 0.49. This is based on an extended volume fraction of 0.66. So when you put 0.66 into the Avrami equation, you get 0.49. Really, that is the transition from mixed columnar equiaxed to fully equiaxed. It's not really columnar to equiaxed transition. What John Hunt said was that you want to model the transition from columnar to mixed columnar equiaxed. He took that and he divided by 100. So he took 0.66 divided by 100, so 2 orders of magnitude to give you 0.0066, and then he left it at that, and then he developed a new curve based on this 2 orders of magnitude lower extended volume fraction. So I think that aspect of CET has never really been investigated thoroughly. John Hunt in his paper said that the selection of the parameter 0.49 was arbitrary. It was based on aspect ratio of 2 to 1 for each crystal. But then he just divided by 100 to get the curve for fully columnar. And I don't think lots of people have focused in on what blocking fraction to use. You'll find in literature people suggesting that you use a blocking fraction of 0.2 for CET. Some would say you use 0.5, 0.7. Some people have used unity. And there's a lot of disagreement out there as to what the blocking fraction is. So what we did was we just looked at saying, can we apply the Kolmogorov principles, phantom and real nucleation, and look at modeling the columnar growth and the Equiaxed growth comparatively and concurrently. And when we did that, it gave a very consistent agreement across all 4 experiments. And trying to go back into the Hunt diagram and trying to, like say, fit the parameters to give the end of the columnar, the start of the mix zone, and the development to a fully Equiaxed zone, it was very difficult to get those parameters to agree, and also to agree with the velocity jump as well. So I think that's where we got with that particular work. And what we've done is we've just said, okay, let's take a different approach. Let's take the blocking fraction out and not ever stop columnar growth and start Equiaxed growth at a blocking fraction. Why don't we let them compete competitively? And I think the results, I've shown you some of the results today, but all 4 experiments that we modeled that way give, I think, quite consistent results. And we tried to, work it back and put it back onto the Hunt diagram, and it was very difficult, practically impossible to get a Hunt agreement with all of those experiments.
There's 2 points. The reason I'm asking the question is the front blocking and the extended volume, as you said, it's 0.63, and if you assume that's a random, close packing of each spheres.
Mm-hmm.
And then it gave you 0.64, so 6.3. Although he said it's random.
Yeah, well, he used 0.49.
It's random close packing pattern. Okay? That's one point. The other point, the reason I'm asking is that when you change velocity, which is almost equivalent to changing the temperature gradient or like summer shock, the effect is you are not only considering the nucleated particle there, which generating new grease. You also have what I call downward arm fragmentation. Summer shock is very effective, generating more dimensional arms. They are not nucleation, basically just
sure. That's very true. It's microgravity. What I would say is that there was a microgravity experiment, so the fragmentation mobility of the fragments comes into question. And it was a grain-refined sample as well. So
Shaun, it's like this. Okay, I'm talking about it. The first point I'm making here is the fragmentation. If it's occurring, okay, and it will change your results completely. It's possible to have more numbers than the nuclear particle may offer you. The other point I'm just saying, I don't understand why this sort of you need microgravity experiments, because there's a transparent system and there's very little density difference. Okay, I'm a bit puzzled with this. Okay, but my point is, the standard fragmentation is not caused by microgravity or by anything else. It's to do with summer shock. It's temperature, local temperature change makes the dendritic arm root becoming very weak. Melting or very quickly, there's just a conditional. But that might be a factor, which has not been considered. And then you said, I changed my model into other factors and consider other factors which made it work. And so that if you have not considered fragmentation, and then at least something I think in the track.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. It's a good point.
Can I make a couple of other points? Sorry if you finished.
Yeah. Huh? I thought Onzo raised his hand up just now.
Oh, sorry. Go on.
Onzo?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I forgot. Yeah. Like,
and
I had
then
a
Brian
question about,
afterwards.
you mentioned at the end that is you're thinking to introduce actually nucleation of IMC as well, intermetallic spaces. Generally, this actually nucleate at the very end of solidification.
Yeah.
So presumably, how do you work it out? What undercooling do you have in those areas in the liquid? In the sense, like you know, you're quite very far from equilibrium. There is a lot of segregation.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in that case, then, because I've used the reparative O model, you will get an estimation of the extra dendritic solute. So you can calculate that. You have the temperature. You need the solute. You need the composition. So you can. I would look at using a reparative O or something along those lines of giving this the composition within the extra dendritic liquid. And the other aspect then is the spatial arrangements, because there now can only nucleate in those channels between the crystals. You've got to apply some of the Kolmogorov correction factors, but that it's done already in other solid state systems where you have nucleation of different phases at different stages in the process, and there are correction factors that have to be applied within this Arami analysis. So those two parameters would be the first two things I would look at. So solute rejection into the extra dendritic liquid, and then the correction factor that takes into account the spatial arrangements and the phantom nucleations in those extra dendritic spaces.
Can you do in a multi-elemental element? I mean, quite likely it's not going to be binary. It's going to be
yeah. Well, we haven't done it yet, but it's something that we could look into. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, Brian, and then Juan.
Yeah, a couple of points if I could, Shaun. By the way, very nice talk. I did enjoy it a lot. Very good. Nice work as well.
Thank you.
So, and of course, I've already said that I found the recalescence bit a little bit coy, but I think we've sorted that one out. Andy was quick on that, and I agree with Fan about the blocking issue. I've got a recommendation for you on that one, which is I think it might be worth exploring a bit more why it doesn't work when you try and put it onto the Hunt diagram, because that implies that there's different things going on in the different experiment. You know, if it was a simple, straightforward blocking mechanism, even, I mean, you know, by modeling it, you're not treating it as a sharp event, but you're treating it as gradual. But if it was gradual, it could be, you know, given a rough parameterization as a sharp event, which is basically what John Hunt's model is presuming. Then you could map it onto that. You know, it wouldn't work. You know, it might not be right. It might give you a different number, but it would work in some way. But the fact it's not working, I think there's something interesting going on there in the different experiments. That's just a suggestion. You might like to think about it. It might not be sufficiently interesting to be worth bothering about, but you know, it sort of implies that the blockings or the blocking that's going on, or the transition, to be more accurate, because it's not a simple block, is happening in a different kind of way in the different experiments, and there might be something worth looking into there. So that was one point I wanted to make. I don't know if you want to respond to that first before. And the other point is a bit more general, but do you want to respond to that one? You don't have to.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I guess. So maybe I just clarify the question. So you're saying that adapting the Hunt model or to look at the nucleation mechanisms, is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that the fact that it doesn't fit onto the simple-minded Hunt model way of thinking about it, implies that the way that the Coulomb to Equiaxed transition is taking place is a bit different. So and because you've done the modeling, it does work. You've got the answer there, if you see what I mean. So I think a little bit more kind of interrogation of why a simple blocking number can't, you know, why your attempts to make that work didn't work might give some insight into the slightly more detailed mechanism of the CET, just how it transits.
Yeah, and one of the things that we could look at, and I'd be interested in looking at there, is not just looking at this gap, this mixed zone max gap in the Hunt diagram. You could transpose onto that lines of equal fraction, so equiaxed fraction. So that would give you a family of curves that would transition from fully columnar to fully equiaxed, instead of just two curves. A little bit like if you look at the work by Quested and Greer, they had these lines of constant equiaxed size, and they were sort of like perpendicular to the CET lines. So they show a map of constant grain size or average grain size across, and that was one of their adaptations to the CET map. But I think then that this work would eventually lead to lines of iso or constant columnar fraction or constant equiaxed fraction, take your pick, whichever one, and then you get a family of curves. So it would go from 0% equiaxed to 100% equiaxed. Admittedly, it would only be for, say, grain refined, heterogeneously nucleated, initiated, grain refined, equiaxed crystals from a grain refiner, not at the moment fragmentation.
Yes, I take it that you won't get the fragmentation out.
Well, you could look at the fragmentation that maybe it perhaps as a flux going past the columnar front into the constitutionally undercooled region, possibly. That might be an interesting way to do it.
No, can I just make a comment? Say you reduce the gross velocity. Okay, that's the equivalency. Okay, the change to the local temperature, like a temperature gradients. Okay. We've changed velocity. We keep other parameters the same for the Bridgman experiments. A Bridgman experiment. It's a sort of a summer shock. There's a factor there. Also, from your experimental results, you can see we increase velocity. Increase velocity. Basically, you're dragging the solid, growing into sort of a hotter liquid, more like equivalence, okay? But it's a sort of a summer shock. That's what I mean. And then you can see suddenly you got a very sharp transition. Yeah. If you reduce it, and then you got a much longer transition, okay? Yeah. Which equivalent, see, you got a smaller temperature gradient, equivalent. It's less a summer shock. So that's there, and I think you may find out, and your model works well for the front blocking if you consider this change of a number of grades. And also don't forget it, the current nucleation model you're utilizing is based on, we see you gave a total number of density, okay, particles, and you assume how many particles are going to be there nucleating. You decided, not the system decided. Yeah. You can change that very easily.
Now that's a good point, and in a way that comes to the more general point I wanted to make, which is about your progenitor functions, because the real problem, it seems to me, is, and you said for the future work, you want to look into the relationship between the progenitor function and your progeny functions. My reaction to that was, well, that's the less interesting point. The really interesting point is, what's the right progenitor function? Right? As you said, there are different models, log normal, normal. These are just assumptions. Yeah. A bit like Fan is saying, you're imposing something on the system. Yeah. Which is a sort of a Deus ex machina imposition. It's not a we don't. That isn't what happens. The system finds its own nucleation behavior, and the different functions you talked about are definitely different. I can understand why you do the model in that way, but the really interesting physical question is, which is the right progenitor function? Yeah.
That's difficult to ascertain.
Because in the end, that's what determines what happens. Of course, the relationship down to the progeny functions I can see are very important too. But and technically in the modelling, that's what you tend to end up focusing on, because you have to impose something. But if you could find a way to compare, which would allow you to discriminate between different progenitor functions, that would be a really insightful thing to begin to be able to, if we could, it's getting like the physics experiments. You could be saying, telling the experimentalists, go and do that experiment in order to work out what is actually going on in nucleation.
I didn't maybe put it as eloquently as that, but that would be the reverse progenitor function. Which don't get me wrong, that has its own challenges.
Yeah, sure.
But that would be the idea, is that if could you do some experiments, say like on a casting, on maybe a TP1 test or something like this, and analyze and get some statistics across the grain structure, and develop up what those progeny were from the final, and then some kind of data mining going backwards to try and say then rebuild the progenitor function that would have given you all of those progeny functions. And I think that's really an interesting goal, I think, here, to try and characterize fully a grain refiner.
Yeah, agreed. I see that. In that case, I think what you were saying with that is the same as what I was thinking too. I thought you were saying something different. Good.
Thank you.
Okay, just one more question from Hua Man. I think Hua Man is waiting very patiently.
It's a very interesting talk, and you build a link between the nucleation and the mass structure. We have kind of a similar idea about that. And I have two short questions. The first question is, did you observe the view of the nucleation in the directional solidification as Enzo suggested?
The real nucleation.
The view of the nucleation.
It's impossible to get the real nucleation because of the stereology problem. So you simply can't see them. I mean, you have an idea that there are some nuclei. Sometimes you can look very closely at a crystal, and because it's a skeletal structure, you look behind it and you say there might be something nucleating behind it and growing, but it's very hard to say. It's very hard to separate it out. So you can't really see the real nucleation events, all of them. You can see most of them, but not all of them. Some are hidden. So you can't really get that. Now, what I will say is the real nucleation and the real volume is what drives the latent heat. So indirectly, because of the thermal agreement, that would give confidence that the volume fraction and that the real nucleation numbers are correct.
No, what I mean is Enzo found during directional solidification, the nucleation happens wave by wave. Did you? So did you observe similar phenomena?
Then you ask Enzo, not
Shaun. I know. I understand.
They did the same experiment. If Enzo found, but you didn't find that, especially in the gravity, it'd be very interesting.
Yeah, I haven't modeled Enzo's experiment. He had different process parameters, and that would be worth looking at. I do think there's an interplay between latent heat and solute rejection in those cases.
And
I think that there is a tantalizing view into looking at this thinning of the dendrites, switching on and switching off the nucleation as well with the recalescence. I think that could be something that might be happening within Enzo's experiments. The nucleation might be switched off because of this oscillatory nucleation. It might be switched off because, number one, solute rejection, and then the front grows up again. But it could also be switched off by latent heat. So there could be some latent heat releasing ahead as well. So it could be a combination. It'd be very interesting when in a full model with thermal and solute rejection to investigate that more thoroughly. I agree.
Shaun, I think it's very important. If you do model, if you want to model that, you have to consider the solid is much lighter than the liquid. And as you grow to some size, they will move up. At the initial growth, they will stay in the same place, only becoming bigger size, and then they go up.
Yeah, buoyancy.
But they left the solute behind. With the solid move up, the solid would not bring the solute reject, as he said earlier. It will leave the solute elements, atoms, at that place, but only the solid move up. If you model that, and then you can see that everything is understandable. The type of formation of crystals here.
Yeah. So the microgravity experiment make I confirm this. Yes or not. The second question is Professor Fan and Brian already mentioned some. In the NPF approach, you used a thermal nucleation model.
Yeah.
So this is specific for some particles or for general?
Well, I used a normal distribution just as a general.
No, I didn't mean the distribution. I mean you use a thermal nucleation model.
Yeah.
For your approach. So this is for some specific case, or it is the general. I mean it depends on the particles, or it's for in any case this model will be applicable.
Yes, it's general case. Now, and how do you get to athermal? And I had some discussion with reviewers on this point, and some had suggested that you should be using Arrhenius equations for nucleation, and that the athermal nucleation had no physical basis. But I argued back to say that athermal nucleation does have a physical basis. So really what we're modeling is Greer's initiation athermally. So
actually, actually, this model is very close to our idea. It means the nucleation is deterministic.
Yeah.
Actually, we agree that we have the same idea about the nucleation. And okay.
Okay.
Yeah. That's thank you, additional Marcus. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Okay. Are there any more questions? If there's no more question, I think we would like to close this talk, and then I think Shaun wants to have a follow-up discussion about collaboration and future work. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. So, okay, in that case, can I ask only the LiME Hub members, the academic members, stay if they want to discuss about collaborations, and then the others, if they can sign off, please. Fan, are you around?
I have to go to another meeting, and so Shaun, you have a good discussion with my colleagues, and I'm looking forward to work with you. And if we have any future chances, I think definitely.
That's great. Thank you. Well, thank you for joining, Professor Fan. It was great to have you in this morning. So.
And a wonderful job. Oh, can I ask you? You know, we are writing up the hub report, and can we utilize your feasibility study as a case study?
Of course.
And I thought, I think, as I can discuss with you, like a best 2-page description. We got a particular format. You can fill in some results in, describe the project. As you can discuss with, communicate with Shaun. Well, for 2-page is a template.
I'll do that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.